2NURFM.
Good morning, Jim.
Morning, Mark.
Today, an Australian but very much an international story, the plight and current circumstances surrounding one Julian Assange.
Yes, Mark, I thought it'd be interesting to just recap some of the things that are going on and also try and dispel some of the mythologies that have grown up around him. One of the big ones is that he's not a publisher, that he's merely a ratbag who hacks into things and then makes things public, but he's not deemed to be a publisher, like we would say that the New York Times, the Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, they're all published vehicles. WikiLeaks is seen in some ways, or there are attempts to portray it as not a vehicle for publication. I think that's clearly not true, but the more that story is repeated, the harder it is for the issues around Julian Assange to be tabled clearly and understood. So that's the first one. The second is that, the US never had any intention of prosecuting him. Assange has maintained that he would not be safe on the streets, that the US would work in ways to extradite him from wherever he was if they could. Allegedly, well, not allegedly, the US government publicly denied all of this up until the time that he was released onto the streets and then arrested for skipping bail. And once he was in custody in the British legal system, he then was fair game for the US government as they understood it. Now, again, Assange was proved correct that the US government had, going back a couple of administrations, been quite keen to prosecute him. The fact that they had the charges all ready to roll as soon as he was arrested suggests that they'd been working on this for some time. And the charges revolve around conspiring to hack into government computers and so forth, and then publishing classified documents. Certainly, it's quite clear he published classified documents. The second thing that goes with that, though, is that the idea of conspiring is one of those catch-all, conspiracy charges are one of those catch-all things that governments like to use. So just imagine that, for example, you have a source for a news story, and that source comes to you and says, look, I know about X and Z. If I can get you that information, would you make that public on your radio show? And you would weigh that up and say, this is in the public interest. So you say yes. Now you've just conspired to obtain secret documents or secret information. You haven't even asked where it's coming from or whatever. That doesn't matter. So that's the sort of issue around conspiracy. It gets in the way of journalists doing their job, if you like. So that's another dimension. Then there's the issue that Assange allegedly published names of people whose lives were then potentially at risk. Now, the US has made that claim quite strong in the court case that's going on at present in London, but there's no serious evidence that they're tabling at this stage that's been made public. But the issue is that around Assange's role and WikiLeaks' role, that they published information that named names. Now, that's certainly true in some cases, but the allegation goes further. It's that Assange knowingly and willingly wanted to put lives at risk. Now, that's, from what we can gather, is not really true. The evidence that is in the public domain, and certainly some of the evidence was put together by Mark Davis, the ABC journalist, in a ABC program, I think actually was on Dateline. It was screened on Inside WikiLeaks. And it was quite clear from that that Julian Assange went to great lengths to ensure that the redactions took place, that as much as possible was redacted to protect names. He contacted the Pentagon, and they didn't want to be involved. They didn't want to assist him in doing that, of course, because they would then be complicit.
Absolutely.
And there's also evidence that the Guardian journalists were quite keen to publish regardless, and that's on film, that they were stating, look, let's publish now, don't worry about the names, that's not a major issue. So that's another dimension, that he's being blamed for things that he had no control over. The actual second, one of the tranches, the Cablegate level of emails that were then made public, the encryption for those was made public by the Guardian journalists in a book that they published called Cablegate. They gave the title of one of their chapters the encryption code, so that anybody could then take that code and unencrypt the files. That was not WikiLeaks' doing, nor Assange's, but he is seen as the one. The other thing that I think is really important here is that the major publishers that he was allying with, WikiLeaks team was going to team up with the New York Times and the Guardian. At the last minute, they stepped back and allowed WikiLeaks to publish first. The strategy there was that they would then no longer be publishing in the first instance. They would be publishing stories about WikiLeaks publishing, so they would not be the ones engaged in the actual publication of classified documents, because they would then be reporting on what someone else had done. Now, the New York Times and the Guardian have both made a big deal about their level of responsibility, but it seems to me that their role in this has been less than honourable, especially when you consider that the New York Times, it likes to portray itself as the purveyor of truth and integrity, but its history and complicity with the US in Vietnam, in reporting on that war, in the invasion of Iraq. They published a mea culpa over their support for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, claiming that they were duped, that they got it wrong. But they're still publishing stories that are pretty sympathetic and gung-ho towards the US government's efforts all around the world. The Guardian, of course, has a much more varied approach, but its role in the WikiLeaks process at the time, back in 2011, was not what one would expect of somebody publishing. So you put all of that together, and Julian Assange's and his legal team's assertions about their being set up by the US government, as it were, to sort of take a fall, it all starts to sort of point less about the culpability of Julian Assange as a publisher and more about the politics behind all of this. One final thing, in 2016, Donald Trump spent a lot of time in October praising WikiLeaks. Okay, he was running for election. WikiLeaks were dumping the cables and the emails around Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump made lots of mileage out of praising WikiLeaks, recommended people read WikiLeaks, etc. April this year, I think it was, he publicly stated he knows nothing about WikiLeaks. So now they're enemy number one. Finally, Mark, one more thing that I think that we need to take about this. This is not just about individual US presidents pursuing, a particular dissident. It's about a systematic role of the US government in silencing the press when it doesn't suit their particular purposes. And I think the really important issue here is, if we want a free press, then we need to sort of be able to call the government to account. And what we're seeing here is somebody who's being punished in various ways, even before he's found guilty. He's innocent until proven guilty, but he's being treated like a guilty person and subjected to some quite unacceptable treatment by authorities. So at the moment, he's fighting that fight. The courts may well find him guilty, or at least they may well find that there's a case to answer vis-a-vis the extradition, and he will then have his time in court in the US, if indeed he goes to court in the US, given the way in which they operate out of Guantanamo Bay. But that's a whole other set of issues that we can only speculate on at this stage.
I think that the thing is, you mentioned some of the other papers and everybody taking that step back, so it's probably, from their point of view, they're going, hang on a minute, we don't want to be the fall guy, so as to speak. Maybe there are just some things that, if things are classified, that we're not supposed to be reporting on.
Well, there's a good case to be made that some things need to be kept secret. But where governments act in what might be deemed a criminal manner, or in ways that contravene international law, or in some other immoral way, then there's a case to be made that there's a public interest angle, and that journalists and publishers have a responsibility to get the truth out as they see it. So yes, there are cases, I think, to be made where publishing stuff is not in the public interest, and it shouldn't shouldn't be published. But part of the role of a free press is to hold power to account, to hold governments to account, so that they are not doing things in secret that should be a matter of public record, that should be something that the voters know about and are able to take into account when they go to the polls. So the idea of the press keeping governments honest and accountable is a very important part of a functioning democracy. The more that role gets curtailed and narrowed, the less our democracy has the freedoms that we believe it should have.
The ongoing story of Julian Assange, no way over yet. I'm sure we'll be hearing about this for a long time to come. Our Professor of Politics, Dr. Jim Jost, thank you for your time.
Mark.